Great. Are you ready, Michael? Okay,
Mhm.
I'll introduce you. Great. Hi everyone. It's great to see you all. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Ramsey-Musolf. He is a professor of physics at UMass Amherst and director of Amherst Center for Fundamental Interactions. He's also the T.D. Lee Chair Professor at the T.D. Lee Institute at Shanghai Jiao Tong University. And I've known him for quite a long time. Our paths cross different ways. I think I'm following him at, to different parts of the world when I can catch him or keep up with him. I also know him as a longtime and active advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion in physics, particularly for sexual and gender minorities. So thank you for that work. Professor Ramsey-Musof's research is on physics beyond the standard model at the interface of nuclear and elementary particle theory with cosmology and particle physics as the focus. With this, I'll let him take it away, and we're looking forward to your talk.
All right, well, thanks very much, Raina and Mike, for the invitation and the opportunity to give a talk. It's really great to see everyone, and I'm hoping someday soon to be able to come down to Wright Lab in a three-dimensional form. But today we'll be in the 2D situation. So let me share my screen and go ahead and get started. Okay, so the scientific topic I'm going to talk about today is really at the interface of fundamental particle physics and cosmology, and we'll get into that in a minute. But because of the unique situation I have with position in China, position in the U.S., I thought I would take a little time to give you all a little bit more background about that. As Raina said, my positions are at UMass Amherst, where you all know where that is, and Shanghai, I think you all know where that is, at the new T.D. Lee Institute. And the science that we're doing in both places is a bit distinct. In Shanghai, the focus is really on early universe quantum field theory, and in particular, the topic I'll be talking about today. At UMass, our emphasis is more on fundamental symmetry tests, such as neutrinoless double beta decay and neutrino properties, baryogenesis, and electroweak precision tests. So it's actually kind of a big program now that I'm trying to coordinate and lead, and involves right now about 18 researchers globally. And you might ask, why this sort of crazy life between the two continents? And so apart from the scientific opportunity, there's a bit of more of a story here that I wanted to mention that involves the two people that are pictured at the bottom of the screen, T.D. Lee on the right and Sam Treman on the left, who was my advisor at Princeton. And when I was a student at Princeton, T.D. Lee and Sam Treman worked together on a program known as the Cuspia program, which brought many students and early career physicists from China to the US to develop their education and careers scientifically. And I always felt that was a very inspiring model for global cooperation and connection in the scientific community. And since then, my own career has been intimately connected to the scientific community in China. So as a way to honor, the impact that Sam had on my career, as well as this real, I think, important idea of building scientific connections across the globe, I'm trying to do something like that with my own program and sort of call myself a bit of an ambassador between the communities in the two places, which, in light of what's going on in the globe right now, I think is becoming an increasingly important thing to do to try to maintain our scientific connections. And, whatever's going on in the globe, the thing that unites us as physicists is our passion to understand and sort of delve into the fundamental laws of nature and how they work. And so I've adopted my motto for this part of my life, which is science first, or in Mandarin, 科学第一. So today I'll be focusing on the science, but I wanted to also say a little bit about the T.D. Lee Institute, which is a bit new, and was founded in 2016 to honor the great legacy of Professor Lee. And its mission includes continuing this theme of providing a platform of support for very talented early career physicists, as well as an opportunity and a context to bring together the global and the Chinese scientific communities, and of course to do outstanding science. So all very much in the keeping of T.D. Lee's sort of spirit. Also, this institute is rather unique, I think, in the globe as a research institute because it includes in a major way both experiment and theory, and it does so in a way that crosses three subfields: particle and nuclear physics, astronomy and astrophysics, and quantum science. And the last sort of theme is to maintain internationality. So right now, as you see on the lower right of my screen here, of the faculty that we have at the Institute, about 40% are non-Chinese nationals, such as myself. So we're really trying to keep that sort of spirit alive in this challenging global time. I live in the particle and nuclear physics division, and you can see that from the photos, we have quite some array of early career and not so early career scientists. And it's a really great group of people to work with, some of whom you may actually know. And the experimental physics, I think, has a lot of overlap with what is happening at the Wright lab. There's a lot of emphasis on low background, deep underground science, multi-messenger science, of course, as well as collider physics. And so it's a nice, I think, a nice opportunity for maybe more dialogue in the future. And I do not want to forget UMass, which is just up the street from everyone. And this is a center that was founded when I arrived in 2013. And many of you have been to the UMass ACFI for workshops, which are designed, again, to really bring people together across the frontiers in fundamental interaction physics. And I look forward to more opportunities maybe to build more connections with the Wright Lab on this particular aspect of the UMass program. So that being said, let me now turn to the science. And so here's what I'd like to try to accomplish in the rest of the talk. The first is to motivate for you what I call the scientific opportunity associated with the possibility that if we extend the standard model beyond the standard model, that there would be an electroweak phase transition in the breaking of electroweak symmetry, which does not happen in the standard model only universe. And I recognize that there are mostly experimentalists listening to this talk, and so I'll try to be a little less focused on the theoretical fine details and more on the big picture ideas. And so this opportunity is a really big idea. And then I'm going to introduce on the theory side how we use effective field theory to try and study this possibility and illustrate how that interplays with calculations using the lattice at finite temperature, which people who've been involved in RIC physics are probably familiar with in that context. And then finally, I'm going to highlight some results that draw on this interplay, which I think are teaching us some interesting things. So the key ideas that I hope you will take away are the following. The first idea is that there is a scale in nature that I call the electroweak temperature. And this scale provides us a clear target for addressing this question, a clear beyond the standard model target for addressing this question of whether or not there was an electroweak phase transition. And this is a target for both collider physics and gravitational wave physics, which I'll say something about toward the end of the talk. And so unlike a lot of other beyond the standard model scenarios where the mass scale and the couplings could be anywhere, maybe or maybe not within the reach of experiment, I think this kind of question is well poised to be experimentally accessible because of the existence of this scale. The second bullet point is that there are really simple arguments that are almost back of the envelope that tell us that any beyond the standard model physics that changes the thermal history of electroweak symmetry breaking from what it is in the standard model cannot be arbitrarily heavy with respect to the electroweak temperature and can't be coupled to the standard model too weakly. And that's part of why there's a real opportunity for experiment. And then finally, for the more sort of theory side of things, that if we're really going to make a robust confrontation of theory and experiment, there's a new era of theory that has to be done that uses EFT methods and non-perturbative or lattice calculations. And I'm going to illustrate why that's important in the later parts of the talk. So here are some of the papers that I'm going to be drawing on just for your reference in case anyone's interested in the future. I do want to make some important acknowledgements. The first is that in case there's anyone listening today who's worked on this topic and whose work I don't cite, it's my apologies because simply running out of time to put a lot of references in the talk. And equally important, my own work has depended decisively on a fantastic cohort of early career theorists whom I've listed in this slide here, several of whom are now postdocs at the T.D. Lee Institute. So here's the outline for the rest of the time. I'm going to spend a little time on the big picture context and questions that we're trying to answer. I will summarize the consequences of the arguments for why this question is a good target for collider physics and gravitational wave physics. Spend some time on the reasons why we worry about theoretical robustness, and then spend the last little bit of time talking about what I call the gravitational wave collider inverse problem, and then a brief outlook. So context and questions. So why is the possibility of an electroweak phase transition interesting? Well, from my standpoint, there are three reasons listed in the bullets here. The first is that since the discovery of the Higgs boson, which we believe is responsible for electroweak symmetry breaking, it's front and center to understand more fully what was the thermal history of that symmetry breaking. The second is the possibility that the baryon asymmetry could have been produced in conjunction with electroweak symmetry breaking. And if so, that requires a phase transition, in particular first order phase transition. And the third is the possibility that such a phase transition could become a source of experimentally observable gravitational waves. So for example, if LISA were to see a signal, could it have been a result of a phase transition in the early universe? I want to spend some time on this first bullet because in my experience, it's the one that gets the least attention and the one that's, from my standpoint, perhaps the most interesting. Maybe not for everyone else, but for me it is. And I want to do so by making an analogy with something that's familiar to everyone here, which is the thermal history of quantum chromodynamics. Here's this well-known slide of the QCD phase diagram where you have baryon chemical potential on the horizontal axis, the temperature on the vertical axis. And as we've learned from the Rick experiments and lattice calculations, that when the universe cooled from the quark-gluon plasma phase to the hadron gas phase at essentially zero baryon chemical potential, the transition is a smooth crossover. At the same time, it's also believed that at some finite non-zero baryon chemical potential, there is the onset of a first order transition history. And the place where that turns on is the critical point. And as we know, the beam energy scan is aiming to see if one can find the evidence for that or the location for that critical point. So as you know, lots of effort has gone into the QCD phase diagram. So for this talk, the question is, what is the electroweak theory analog of the QCD phase diagram? And for theorists, the way we start with addressing that question is to study what's called the finite temperature effective potential, which is shown sort of in cartoon form on the upper left of this screen. What it is, it's essentially the free energy vertical axis as a function of the Higgs vacuum expectation value on the horizontal axis. And what's depicted here are two representative thermal histories of that effective potential. The first one on the left is a first order history. And in this case, at very high temperature, the lowest energy point is at the origin. That's the electroweak symmetric point. As the temperature cools, a second minimum develops away from the origin. Eventually, at the critical temperature, Tc, it becomes degenerate with the symmetric minimum. And at some temperature below that critical temperature, the universe makes a transition to the broken phase. Now, in the standard model, as one increases the Higgs mass, which is the same as increasing the Higgs coupling to itself, that barrier that you see in the first order history between the two phases gets weaker and weaker until it eventually goes away and becomes a second order transition, and ultimately becomes, as in QCD, a crossover transition. And we've learned about that from lattice studies that were done in the 90s, actually. So what's on this slide in the bottom left is compilation of results from lattice calculations of determining the maximum mass of the Higgs for which there would be a first order electroweak phase transition. And what you can see is that it's somewhere in the 70 to 80 GeV range. So if we put that into a phase diagram, it would look like something on the upper right. There would be the Higgs mass on the horizontal axis, the temperature on the vertical axis. For some range of Higgs masses, there would be a first order electroweak phase transition as one cools from the symmetric phase at high temperature to the broken phase, the Higgs phase at low temperature. And then that stops somewhere around 70 to 80 GeV. And so for 125 GeV Higgs, it's a smooth crossover. So if all we have is the standard model, then the transitions, the phase transitions in QCD and in the electroweak sector were both crossover. So that would be sort of the end of the story. Now, many of us believe that's not the end of the story because for many reasons, there are strong arguments for the existence of beyond the standard model physics at or below the TeV scale. So the question we can ask is, how does this picture and the phase diagram change in the presence of such physics? Was there an electroweak phase transition? Was it first order? And in particular for baryogenesis and gravitational waves, was it strongly first order? That's what SFO means, strongly first order. So that's the question. Now, in thinking about this question, I've been inspired by this plot and the discussion in Steve Weinberg's well-known paper on gauge theories at finite temperature. And let me explain to you a little bit what this plot is. So what Weinberg did is he took a different theory, not the standard model, something called an ON cross ON theory. And in this theory, there are two Higgses, one for each ON group. And so the Higgses getting vacuum expectation values would break the symmetry of each factor. He called those the eta and the chi particle. I'll call them phi 2 and phi 1. And what Weinberg pointed out is that depending on the values of those masses at zero temperature, or the mass parameters in the Lagrangian, the thermal history of the symmetries of this theory could be quite rich. Let's do an example, starting with 1. So 1, there's a choice for the Higgs masses at zero temperature. And if you follow my cursor, follow the line, this is supposed to represent what happens as the universe cools. So eventually, the universe goes to a broken phase called B. It starts with the most symmetric phase and goes to the broken phase B. And so, you know, the values of the mass parameters are given by the dot here. This is sort of like our standard model picture. You know, you start with the most symmetric phase and you go to the broken phase. But what if you start with the scenario like number 3, where the choice of the masses is different at zero temperature? Then you might start in the less symmetric phase at high temperature. And as the universe cools, actually go for a period of time to a more symmetric phase. So this would be symmetry restoration. And then again, go to the broken phase B. Or follow 4, you start with the least symmetric phase, then go to a more symmetric phase, the most symmetric phase, then the less symmetric phase, et cetera, et cetera. So the moral of the story is, in this really simple setup, there's quite a rich array of histories of symmetry breaking that are well beyond what we're used to thinking about in the standard model. So if one were to take these ideas and translate them to the standard model, here's how you might think about it. Let's imagine taking the standard model and adding to the scalar sector, the Higgs sector, a new Higgs-like particle called capital phi. And let's ask, what would the possible thermal histories of symmetry breaking be in this context? And to think about that, here's a plot that has on this axis here, where my cursor is, the of the beyond the standard model scalar, and on this axis is the Higgs. Here's what the potential energy might look like today at zero temperature. We're supposed to live over here in the Higgs phase. And the question is, at high temperature, if we start at the symmetric phase in the origin, how did we end up in the Higgs phase? Well, one possibility is a direct transition, like Weinberg's number one, to the Higgs phase from the symmetric phase. But in contrast to the standard model, it could be a phase transition, a first order phase transition in particular, due to the presence of this new scalar. Another possibility might be that the universe first goes to a different phase associated with beyond the standard model scalar, and then makes a transition to the Higgs phase. So even with this really simple sort of setup, you can see there's already some interesting possibilities for different thermal histories than we would have in the standard model. So the questions that I and my collaborators have been asking are the following. First of all, what is the potential, what is the landscape of these potentials and what their thermal histories? And secondly, how can experiment be used to probe these potentials? And third, how reliably can theory compute the thermodynamics and the dynamics? So that's bullet one. Bullets 2 and 3, I'm going to spend a little less time on why they're interesting. So for baryogenesis and gravitational waves, one needs the transition to be first order, and a first order transition proceeds by a process of bubble nucleation. What that means is that the universe starts in the background of the symmetric phase, and as the temperature cools, bubbles of broken electroweak symmetry nucleate or merge and expand in that background of the symmetric phase. And so the action for baryogenesis takes place at the boundaries of the bubbles, and then a baryonic symmetry is made and put into the bubble interiors. And it turns out for that to be successful, the transition has to be quote unquote strong first order transition. And for baryogenesis, there also has to be beyond the standard model CP violation, which I will not talk about today. But a strong transition is also important for the possibility of gravity waves, because when the bubbles collide, there's potential detonations, there's turbulence, there's generation of sound waves in the aftermath, all of which become sources for gravitational waves. And so those are the interesting features for these 2 points here. So there's a lot of motivation, it seems to me, to study this problem. And now I want to tell you a little bit about why there's some good prospects that a combination of theory and experiment might provide a pretty definitive answer about the thermal history. For collider physics in particular, there are 2 questions we need to ask. What is the mass of the new degree of freedom? And is that within the reach of the colliders? And when it interacts with the standard model, how strongly does it interact? Which tells us how much precision do we need in studying things in colliders to see the effects. So mass scale and precision. So let's think about how experiment might probe these kinds of potentials. One way is to make the new particle directly in say a proton-proton collision at the LHC. Another way is to look for the small effects that new particle will have on the standard model Higgs boson. I call this, the new scalar tickles the standard model Higgs. So this would come under the purview of precision Higgs studies. And then the third is the astrophysical consequences of seeing, if we're fortunate, the relic gravitational waves that come from the collisions of these bubbles that were catalyzed by the presence of this new particle. So again, for experiment, the kinds of questions we want to ask are, how heavy can the new particle be? How strongly does it couple to the standard model Higgs? And can it be discovered in future experiments at the LHC or beyond? Now, here comes this idea of the electroweak temperature making this question a realistic target. So to define this quantity, let's start with the red box here. This is a formula for the effective potential of the Higgs at high temperature in something called the leading order effective theory. And the important terms involve an h squared, h is the Higgs, quadratic term, and a quartic term. This is the Higgs self-interaction term. And in the quadratic term, there's a dependence on the temperature squared and a temperature scale called T naught squared. So what is T naught squared? T naught squared is in the second box. And you can see if you go all the way over to the right, it's proportional to the Higgs vacuum expectation value squared. but it is not identically equal to the Higgs vacuum expectation value squared. It depends on the other couplings in the theory, like the Higgs self-interaction, the gauge couplings in the electroweak sector, and the top quark Yukawa coupling and some other less important standard model couplings. So depending on what values nature had chosen for these parameters, the T naught would be either close to or could be rather far away from the electroweak scale, the Higgs VEV. So if you take 246 GeV for little v, which we know from muon decay, muon lifetime, and if you take the known values of the standard model couplings and put it into this formula, you get a number around 140 GeV. So it's about 60% or so of the weak scale. So it's actually below the weak scale, but it's not huge. And so this number is well within the reach of, as energy scale, well within the reach of our experimental efforts. So I'm going to call that number T electroweak. And so now let's think about how there could be an alternate thermal history of electroweak symmetry breaking at that temperature. And in particular, for the reasons I outlined earlier, let's ask what it would take for that transition to be first order, which means there has to be some barrier between the symmetric phase and the Higgs phase. So I'm going to illustrate that again with this simple setup of a new scalar particle called phi that interacts with the standard model Higgs through something called the Higgs portal, which I'll define a little more precisely in the next slide. And the way I want to think about it is in terms of some possible representative thermal histories, which are depicted along the bottom of this slide. On the lower left is plotted the new scalar direction and the Higgs direction on the horizontal axis. And this thermal history is our simplest one, where we start at the origin, and at the electroweak temperature, the universe transitions to the Higgs phase. And as I've said, in the standard model, this is a crossover transition. But it turns out that if you introduce a new interaction with phi and the Higgs that goes like the square of each one, then there are thermal loop effects that could make this transition a first order transition. A second possibility is in the middle here. This is what is known as a two-step transition history, where the universe first makes a transition to the phi phase and then a transition to the Higgs phase. And it turns out that this same interaction can create a barrier between the phi phase and the Higgs phase. So when this transition occurs at the electroweak temperature, it becomes first order. A third possibility is over on the right, where one makes a transition to a state that has vacuum expectation values for both fields in a single step. And here, there's another interesting interaction that's the square of h and 1 power of phi that also can generate a barrier between the origin and the broken phase. So we can use these generic and representative setups to ask about the mass scale and the precision. Now, for the first two, again, there are these really simple arguments, which I will not go through in this talk, but if you're really interested, you can read in the paper, that tell us that if either of these had a first order transition at the electroweak temperature, then the mass of the phi particle couldn't be too heavy, not beyond around 700 GeV, which is well within the reach of either the LHC or possible future collider studies. The third one, the situation here is a little different. So this interaction causes the Higgs state and the phi state to mix at zero temperature, just like in neutrino oscillations, with mixing. And this mixing has important effects on Higgs properties that can be measured. And so we can ask, what are the bounds on the mixing angle that you would expect if you're going to have a first order phase transition? And there, it turns out that if you impose these considerations that the baryon asymmetry is made at the electroweak temperature and then preserved today, and or that gravitational waves are produced and seen, then there's a really simple criteria that we can use to put a bound on the mixing angle. And the criteria is that the ratio of the coefficient of that interaction, called A1, and the product of the Higgs coupling to itself and the electroweak temperature has to be bigger than about 1. And with a little bit of work, you can show that this means the mixing angle is bigger than about 0.01, or for people who are really into the Higgs stuff, the self-coupling of the Higgs can't differ from its standard model value by too much, about 0.3%. So the point is, these are not 10 to the minus 6 or 10 to the minus 10. These are, order 1% or larger. And that, again, is in principle within the realm of precision Higgs studies in the future. So collider target and potentially gravitational waves. So with these general considerations in mind, you should know that a lot of people over the decade in the theory and model building and phenomenology communities have worked on specific models that basically reflect these features. And so there's just a lot of reason to think that one could see something. The question I want to ask now is, should you believe anything anyone has said? And that goes to this topic of theoretical robustness, which I will try to do is, in as accessible a way as possible for experimentalists. And here are some of the papers that I'm going to draw on. So models in phenomenology that address this tantalizing prospect of an electroweak phase transition, how reliable are they? And why should we worry? Well, we should worry because there are different inputs from the theory that we take in analyzing the transition. They're shown here in two categories. One is the thermodynamics. What is the phase diagram? And for gravitational waves, when the bubbles collide, they release something called the latent heat. So we have to calculate that. How well can we do that? And then for the dynamics, how quickly do these bubbles nucleate? Do they nucleate fast enough that the transition will actually occur as the universe is expanding? If so, what is the nucleation temperature, T sub n? How long does it last? Which then determines the frequency spectrum for gravitational waves. And then for baryogenesis, there's an important input, which is called the Electroweak's phaleron, and we need to know its rate in the broken phase. So there are all these inputs that we need for theory, and it's challenging to do these well. And let me illustrate one reason, perhaps the most important reason why this is a challenge. In particular, a challenge for people who do what we learn about in quantum field theory courses, perturbation theory. So here's the example. Here's a loop integral that involves a bosonic particle at non-zero temperature. And for purposes of illustration, I'll let it have a coupling coefficient that comes in, g squared. It turns out that at finite temperature, what we do are three-dimensional integrals. This is in momentum space. Because it's at finite temperature, we need to put in a temperature-dependent Bose distribution function, and then there's going to be some number of propagators that come into the loop. Okay, this is all like quantum field theory, but in three spatial dimensions and with the temperature dependence. Now let's ask, what happens to the part of this integral at low momentum, the infrared region? Well, in the low momentum region, this bosonic distribution function, to a very good approximation, just looks like the temperature over the mass. So we could, in that region, factor it out of the integral and get something that looks like what's on the upper right. So we have just a momentum integral with no temperature. We have a prefactor that's this g squared times t over m. And so the effective expansion parameter for perturbation theory is no longer g squared, it's really g squared t over m. And that's a problem. Let me explain why. Down on the lower left is a formula for the mass. Let's say it's the Higgs mass at finite temperature. And in general, it gets two contributions. One is from the Higgs vacuum expectation value itself. That's the C1 term. And the second is from thermal temperature effects. That's the C2 term. So I'll call that m squared t of phi. And the problem is that near the phase transition, phi is getting close to 0. And C2 is a number that's typically much less than 1. And so the mass near the phase transition is much smaller than g times temperature. So if I put that in the formula for the expansion parameter, you can see that this is no longer a small number, which means that there is no convergent perturbative expansion. And so the tools that we would use to do the calculations essentially don't work. Just to make this a little more quantitative, let's call this effective expansion parameter G effective For technical reasons, there's typically factor pi that's put in there. And as again, this has this problem because of the infrared behavior of the integrals. MT of phi can actually be measured in lattice studies. And so for the standard model, that's been done. And so when the value of the zero temperature Higgs mass is close to this 70 to 80 GeV range, this critical Higgs mass, this G effective is order 1. And so there is no truncatable expansion. Okay. So we're kind of stuck, even though that's what everyone does. So more generally, perturbation theory has lots of places where things can go wrong. I've talked about probably the most important one. I've listed a few others here, which I won't talk about today. The way to solve these problems is to do non-perturbative calculations, which just sums everything to all orders, and particularly these infrared regions of these loop integrals. But the problem there is that these are computationally and labor-intensive studies. So if you want to do phenomenology, propose a new beyond the standard model scenario and ask whether it would give a first order phase transition, you got to use perturbation theory, but then how much should you really believe it? So to put it another way, I call this the theory meets phenomenology problem. So what you'd like to do is non-perturbative calculations because they're the most reliable, but it's not practical to do everything you want. You have to use perturbation theory, but it's not necessarily reliable. And then, as we'll see a little later on, it's not only quantitatively suspect, in some places it can even get the qualitative features wrong. So our way forward is to do something called benchmarking perturbation theory. And what that means is that we're going to use perturbation theory, but then we're going to test it against lattice calculations in different models at different benchmark choices of parameters to see where perturbation theory is working well enough that we can use it, where it breaks down, and we have to try plan B. So in doing that, the tool that we use to connect the perturbative side of things and the non-perturbative side of things is what's called a dimensionally reduced three-dimensional effective field theory at finite temperature. And so I'm going to say a little bit about that, and this is probably the most theoretical part of the talk. Then we'll show some plots. But let me give you the strategy. The strategy is we're going to employ this effective field theory in two regimes. One regime is where the new particles, the new scalars, are sufficiently heavy that we can integrate them out of the effective theory early on in the EFT process. And the second regime is to include the new degrees of freedom in explicit new lattice calculations. And in both cases, we'll compare the results with perturbation theory and try to benchmark. So EFT, I just want to mention again, in case there's any EFT aficionados listening today, there's actually several EFTs that we use because depending on which of these inputs we're considering, there are additional scales in the problem. So for the thermodynamics, I'm calling this EFT1. If we're worried about nucleation, then there's another EFT because there's a new scale in the problem, which is the inverse size of the bubbles. And the third is the case of baryon number preservation for baryogenesis. There's another scale in the problem that has to do with the sphalerons. We'll call that EFT3. It turns out that EFT is still under construction, so I'm not going to talk about it and mostly talk about the results using EFT1. So we do a process that's called dimensional reduction. I think I'm not going to say a whole lot about that, but I want to mention for EFTs, we do have to organize according to the scales in the problem. So here are the scales for EFTs 1 and 2. There's a scale we call the super heavy scale, which involves what are called the non-zero Matsubara modes. And in case anyone is unfamiliar with that, I have some backup slides on that, but I'm going to assume going forward, you may have heard about that, particularly people who've done, RIC physics and so forth. Then there's the beyond the standard model mass scale, which can be of the same order, larger or smaller than the Matsubara scale. There's the thermal mass scale that goes like G times the temperature. If we're doing bubble nucleation, there is the nucleation scale, which goes like 1 over the bubble radius. And then the lightest scale in the problem is something that goes like the gauge coupling squared times the temperature. The EFT1 that I'm going to rely mostly on involves the scales in this green set of boxes here, and the EFT2 adds to it the nucleation scale because we're worried about nucleation dynamics. So the picture is the following for EFT. So you organize the scales from lightest at the bottom to heaviest at the top. We start with the full theory, and the way the EFT proceeds is we first integrate out these Matsubara mode, non-zero Matsubara mode scale contributions, possibly also the beyond the standard model scale degrees of freedom. We're left with a three-dimensional effective field theory called L3, and that contains things that have masses of order g times t. We can integrate those out, and we're left with a theory called L bar 3 that involves only light degrees of freedom. This is a technical point about doing thermal resummations. I think I'll skip it. I want to focus on the bottom, the light theory. Now, the light theory was actually used in the 90s to do lattice simulations. And in the light theory, it looks a lot like the standard model in three-dimensional form. There's a mass squared parameter for the Higgs and a self-coupling parameter for the Higgs in the three-dimensional theory. And the key point is that the lattice calculations tell us where in the space of mu bar and lambda bar 3 one has to be for the electroweak symmetry breaking transition to be a first order transition. Now, when we only have the standard model, the values of mu bar 3 and lambda bar 3 are not allowed to be in that range. That's why we have crossover transition. But if we have new beyond the standard model degrees of freedom in the full theory, then the values of mu bar and lambda bar in the light theory, the effective field theory, can be where the lattice tells us they need to be for a first order phase transition. And we can still at zero temperature have 125 GeV Higgs. So the idea is to repurpose existing lattice calculations and infer back to where in the full theory one would have to be in the parameters to have a first order phase transition. So just to recap, what we do is we assume the BSM fields are heavy or super heavy in this first incarnation of the EFTs. The BSM parameter, the light theory parameters are functions of the BSM parameters. We're going to use the existing lattice computations to infer back to the full theory about where one has to be. And let me show you in a concrete illustration why this works, and then some results. So I'm going to illustrate with something called the Real Triplet. The Real Triplet, this is funny notation. It's called sigma. It has no QCD quantum numbers. It's a triplet under SU2, and it has no hypercharge. And in the simplest setup, we're going to introduce this interaction I call the h squared phi squared interaction. And again, because we have two scalars in the problem now, there are two directions in field space for which one has to calculate the free energy. And so both thermal loop effects and tree level barriers come in, and we have the possibility of both a one-step transition and a two-step transition to the Higgs phase, according to the cartoon that I showed you earlier. So for the EFT setup that I just discussed, we're going to first concentrate on the one-step transition case where we've integrated out phi, and we're just relying on its loop effects, as told us by the lattice, to determine where in A2 space one has to be to get an first order electroweak phase transition. And why this works is the following. So here's a formula, a couple of formulas. In the upper box is the potential interaction involving the Higgs doublet and the triplet. There's the standard model terms, phi squared and lambda and phi to the fourth. There's analogous terms for the triplet, sigma squared and sigma to the fourth. And then there's the interaction between the two with this coefficient A2. Now, in the second box is the formula for the lambda bar 3 at finite temperature. Turns out it's proportional to temperature times the lambda, the Higgs self-coupling in the four-dimensional theory, and then some loop corrections. And the important point is the loop corrections contain this A2 squared, which comes from the interaction up in the top box. And if you work backwards in this line, first line, you see there's a minus sign here. So there's a minus times an A squared, which means this is an overall negative contribution to lambda 3. And what we need for a first order phase transition is for lambda 3 to be smaller than it would be in the standard model based on the value of lambda that we know from the Higgs mass. So A2 can do the trick because it comes with a minus sign. And so we actually see this in our repurposed lattice calculations. And here, let me show you the phase diagram that comes out of that. On the horizontal axis is the mass of the new scalar, the triplet. On the vertical axis is its coupling to the Higgs, the portal coupling. And these different colored regions correspond to the following. The gray region I'm going to come back to here. It's not accessible in this EFT setup that I just discussed. The blue region is the region the lattice would tell us, lattice plus EFT would tell us, is a crossover transition. The light green region is a first order electroweak phase transition, and the dark green region is a region where our EFT in this incarnation breaks down. Importantly, the boundary between the blue and the light green is something we can never get from perturbation theory. Perturbation theory would mislead us, and I'll show you an example of that a little bit later on. So we have to use this lattice plus EFT to know this. Now, for experiment, there's a lot of interesting information in this plot. In particular, the dotted lines correspond to family of curves for reductions in the rate for the Higgs to decay to 2 photons. And why does this happen? It happens because the neutral component of the triplet has charged partners, and those partners come in loops that can affect the Higgs diphoton decay rate. The coupling that comes into that loop is the same one that affects the phase transition. And the loop also depends on the mass. And so you get this dependence on the mass and the coupling according to these dotted curves here. So experiment in a precision Higgs study measurement might tell us the value of the Higgs diphoton decay rate. And then you might ask, well, what about the mass? Well, there are other ways to get at the mass. I won't talk about them here, but let's just play out a scenario where, for example, we determine the mass is 280 GeV and the Higgs diphoton decay rate is reduced by 10% from the standard model. That would tell us we live in the first order electroweak phase transition region. Whereas if the Higgs diphoton decay reduction were not as large, we would be in the crossover region. So these combinations of measurements can be kind of a barometer in a sense, or a probe of the phase diagram in this setup. So I think it's a very cool putting together of all the pieces of EFT, lattice, and experiment to say something about the thermal history. Now I want to talk about the other case where the triplet is sufficiently light that we have to include it in the simulations. And I won't go through the formula here in the interest of time, but I want to focus on the new possibility that if we're including the scalar particle, in this case, the triplet is a dynamical degree of freedom, there might be this two-step thermal history. So here's now what the phase diagram looks like in the full gore. And it's the same diagram, but different colors. Sorry about that. Again, the horizontal axis is the triplet mass. The vertical axis is the Higgs portal coupling. Now, this dark blue region is the region where the minimum of the potential is not stable. So we don't want to live there because we have to live in a stable minimum. The pink region is that crossover region that I showed you before. Region 4 is the region for a first order phase transition in a single step. And this slice of orange, gray, and blue is the region where a two-step transition history could occur. So that's this thing. Now the crosses correspond to where we did explicit lattice simulations to determine what was the nature of these transitions. And because we can't get that all from perturbation theory. And what we learned from the lattice simulations is that in the orange region, the first step, this first arrow, was a crossover. The second step is first order. And in the blue region, both are first order transitions. Okay. So again, I really need this lattice plus the effective field theory to really give us all the information. Now, here's the caution about perturbation theory, why it can get things wrong qualitatively. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the gravitational wave inverse problem, and then we'll be finished. So let's look at this plot over on the right. On the horizontal axis is the temperature On the vertical axis is what's called the condensate, which is the square of the field over the temperature. The red is for the Higgs doublet, the blue is for the triplet, and the lattice results are the dotted points here. So if we follow my cursor, which starts at high temperature, you can see that the triplet has a discontinuous jump to a non-zero value at some temperature. And then as temperature is further lowered, it goes back effectively to zero, and the doublet jumps up. So that's a succession of two first-order phase transitions, discontinuous. The solid lines are the perturbation theory and the EFT. And you can see they also give us discontinuities, but not at the right temperature. But on the other hand, the slopes agree pretty well. Okay. So perturbation theory has the qualitatively right picture, and even the slopes are right, but the numbers for the temperature, and that's particularly important for gravitational waves, are not correct. Now let's go to the second, and I'm sorry for the noise in the background. There's a little work going on in the house, and they weren't supposed to arrive for another 10 minutes, so I apologize for that. In the second diagram on the left, it's a different choice of the parameters in the model, and you can see here that from the lattice, the transition for the first symmetry breaking is a smooth crossover. There's no discontinuity, whereas the second one is still a discontinuous transition of first order. On the other hand, perturbation theory would tell us it's still a first order transition because it's a discontinuous jump. So in this case, perturbation theory gets the qualitative features wrong, as well as not having the numerics in good agreement. So it's just to reinforce this point that if we're going to say anything really robust in a BSM scenario, we can't get away from non-perturbative simulations combined with perturbation theory. So in the last few minutes, let me go to this gravitational wave collider inverse problem where we're going to apply some of these results, again, to phenomenology. And so what is this collider gravitational wave inverse problem? Well, you might frame it in terms of this question. How can a combination of collider and gravitational wave measurements either identify or rule out a given model? And if it's identified, how can they potentially determine the parameters of the model? And that's going to rely on these two papers here, the discussion, in particular this one that just came out this week that I'm really excited about. So that'll be the last thing I'll show. So let me start with some general considerations. For analyzing gravitational waves, the relevant parameters that we have to include are something that's called alpha, which is essentially the latent heat. It's very closely related to it, which is the heat released in the collisions of the bubbles, and a quantity called beta over H star, which essentially tells us the duration of the transition and sets the frequency of the gravitational wave spectrum. The LISA signal to noise curves, which tell us LISA sensitivity, are given in the lower right of this plot here. So sort of a benchmark is signal to noise of 5, which is the orange one where my cursor is. You know, you wouldn't really conclude anything with 1, but it's way over here. Now, the purple region corresponds to a situation where there's a new BSM scalar that gives us a first order phase transition in a single step, but the scalar is heavy enough that we could integrate it out in that first step of the EFTs. And you can see that in that case, we're way away from being accessible with LISA generation experiments. On the other hand, the colliders could still probe this region, but unlikely to see the effect in a next generation gravitational wave experiment. To get there, one has to go to a regime where the new degrees of freedom are sufficiently light that they're actively involved in the transition. And so that's going to go to this last slide that comes from our recent work to illustrate how that might work. And it's going to be in this model with the real triplet. So let's look at the plot on the upper left. It's a blow up of the phase diagram I showed before. On the horizontal axis, again, is the triplet mass. On the vertical axis is the coupling to the Higgs. The gray region we don't want to live in because that's an unstable electroweak minimum. The light green region corresponds to a single step of symmetry breaking that is a first order transition. The reddish region is the second step of a two-step transition region. And the dotted lines tell us that in order for the transition to actually complete, to occur, you have to be inside the dotted lines. So we can take this phase diagram and project it into the alpha and beta over H star plane. And what we learn is that in order for the region where LISA would be sensitive is given by this thin black line here where my cursor is. So if there were a LISA observation, we would learn something important, maybe about the Higgs portal coupling, but not necessarily so much about the mass. And that's where the collider measurements might come to play. And that's given by these illustrative examples given by these ellipses here for different sort of benchmark measurement scenarios. The dark blue corresponds to making two measurements, one of the mass of the new particle in a collider experiment, and the second by a precision measurement of the Higgs diphoton decay rate. And so outcomes of those experiments might tell us we live inside the blue ellipse. So if you combine that with the gravitational wave observation, the thin black band, you would really narrow down where you are in the model parameter space. That's the kind of the holy grail of the inverse problem for this case. On the other hand, if you only had the collider measurements, the dark, you couldn't tell whether you were in this green region, the first step region, or the region of a second step first order transition, but not gravitational wave accessible. You just wouldn't have enough information. Similarly, if you add a precision measurement of the triplet decay to two Z bosons, you would then reduce the collider region. And so without the gravitational wave measurement, again, you wouldn't know whether you actually had a production of a LISA accessible gravitational wave signal, but you might have at least a narrower constraint on the parameter space. Now, it's interesting to ask, what if all we had was the collider measurements in this sort of setup? What would that tell us about where the possibilities are for gravitational wave observation? And that's shown in the lower right plot, which is in the alpha and beta over H star plane. The benchmark A, the blue ellipse, dark blue ellipse, is now this line that follows my cursor. It overlaps with the light blue. And you can see a portion of it lies inside the LISA accessibility, but to really probe it would require beyond LISA generation gravitational wave measurements. And even beyond anything anyone has currently conceived, if we're in the dark blue case here. So there's a lot to be learned from this that, you know, and I know I'm at my end of my time here, this is my last slide, but in the ideal outcome, a combination of measurements would nail things down. There could be a self-consistency check where these ellipses don't overlap with LISA, and so LISA sees something, but it's not coming from this model, or we need something beyond the LISA generation experiments. And I think there's, a chat thing. So let me go to my conclusions. There's some other recent work I won't talk about, and just go to the outlook here. I know we're at the top of the hour. So here's the takeaway messages I hope you've gotten in spite of some of the theoretical details. First of all, determining the thermal history of electroweak symmetry breaking is really interesting in its own right from a field theory standpoint. And it's also of what I call practical importance for baryogenesis and gravitational waves. Secondly, there's some good prospects that experiment might teach us about the thermal history because of the existence of this scale, the electroweak temperature. And it tells us that the new physics can't be arbitrarily heavy or too feebly coupled to the Higgs if there's going to be an alternate thermal history. And therefore, searches for this new physics have interesting prospects, but we really need to pursue this program of combining EFT and lattice calculations to be confident in our theory. And there's a lot of opportunity for the theoretically inclined to get involved in this work. So I will stop there, and thanks everyone for your attention. And hopefully this was somewhat enlightening for everyone today. Thanks a lot.
Lights in here so you can see us. Maybe any questions?
So yeah, thanks for the very nice talk. So I guess you touched on this, that we want the current vacuum to be stable, but I mean, I guess technically we only need it to be metastable for the age of the universe, kind of. And so, I mean, are there you know, if you measured something at the LHC, could we qualitatively change? My understanding is in the thinner model, we're just on the side of stability, but could you measure something where it would change the ultimate fate of the universe?
In principle, yes. And that goes to a hard problem that I didn't talk about, which is calculating the transition rate out of the metastable vacuum into the, into the wrong vacuum. We need to know that the rate for that transition is the inverse rate is longer than the age of the universe. So in principle, if you measured something and you ended up over in this gray region here, either the model is not viable, or there has to be some really stand on your head thing to keep us in the metastable vacuum. Now, it's not crazy, but then we'd have to be a little more careful about scrutinizing the self-consistency of that. So it's an excellent question. Thank you for that. But I'm assuming for safety's sake that our vacuum is stable.
Another question.
Yeah.
You mentioned Lisa as the providing the measurements relevant. What about LIGO? I guess what's the frequency of these effects?
So the LIGO frequency range is typically too high. And so, these frequencies are sort of millihertz and below. And so LIGO doesn't really fall on this plot here, unfortunately. For other phase transitions, it could, but not for the electroweak phase transition. And that just has to do with these values of alpha and beta over H star that come out of phase transition dynamics.
Thanks. I just wasn't sure what frequencies.
Yeah, it's sort of in millihertz-ish, yeah.
Any other questions for Michael? Are there, what would be a exciting signature that would be coming, at the next or the soonest for?
Well, so there's some chance, for example, that the LHC could make a discovery. Let's say it sees, the LHC is going to make precision measurements of Higgs diphoton. It's also poised to maybe look for new degrees of freedom in this mass range here that's shown on this plot. So to me, that's the most likely place where a first signal would come from. And the LISA horizon, as you know, is sort of a decade away or so. And so that would be after the fact. So, in an ideal setup, you might get this blue ellipse first, and then see whether the LISA sees anything or not. If it does not, that means that in the plot on the lower right, we're lying in this region outside the signal to noise equals to 5 curve. And that would be interesting. Maybe not as exciting, but interesting.
Maybe because it's here. Anything that tabletop experiments can contribute?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I'm going to ask it. Are there anything that tabletop experiments can contribute?
Tabletop. Yes. I don't immediately see a tabletop opportunity for this problem. If I go way back to, where am I going? This one, for the baryogenesis problem, if we have the preconditions for electroweak baryogenesis, then we need this CP violation. And there, the electric dipole moments are the signature tabletop probe. So it'd be very exciting if a first order phase transition were discovered, and then one could really ask, okay, so how big of an effect does that CP violation have to be in order to make the baryon asymmetry, given what we know about the phase transition? And is that consistent with the current limits on EDMs, or maybe even an observation of an EDM? That would be where the other half of that problem would go. And that's definitely tabletop territory.
Thank you. Well, let's thank Michael again.